I ended my own brother's career in front of 200 witnesses, not out of revenge, but because I refused to let him break my son. If you've ever been used by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story is for you. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed to a soft amber glow. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above 200 VIP guests, influencers, and top buyers. The air smelled of aged leather, expensive cologne, and fresh-cut white roses. I stood on the stage in my black tailored suit, heart hammering against my ribs. My eyes locked straight onto my older brother Ellis, who sat at the front table with that familiar smug smile. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. Then I spoke, voice calm but cutting through the silence like a blade. Ellis, everything you're about to celebrate tonight, it was never yours. The entire room went dead quiet. You could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass. Ellis's smile froze. His wife Natalie's eyes widened in shock. I took one slow breath and continued. This story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when blood stops meaning blind loyalty and starts meaning boundaries. If you've ever been used by the people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me, because tonight, I'm finally telling the truth I should have spoken years ago. 9 years earlier, life looked very different. I was 31, freshly divorced, and raising my son Finn alone. The ink on the custody papers had barely dried when I decided to build something from nothing. I poured every ounce of pain, every late night, and every last dollar into creating Hale Craft, a luxury handcrafted leather brand that would one day stand shoulder to shoulder with the great names. I worked in a tiny rented workshop with leaking roofs and second-hand tools. My hands bled from cutting and stitching until I got it right. Finn, only 7 at the time, would sit on a wooden stool beside me doing his homework by the light of a single lamp, asking questions about why leather smelled so good when it was new. Those were hard years, but they were honest. Then Ellis came back into my life. At first, he seemed like the big brother I had always wanted. He showed up with coffee, patted me on the back, and said all the right things. "You're building something special, Rowan. Let me help." He offered connections, introduced me to a few suppliers, and even lent a small amount of money when cash flow got tight. I was grateful. God, I was so grateful. For the first couple of years, it felt real. We were family pulling together. He watched the brand grow. He saw the orders coming in. He saw the respect I was finally earning in an industry that doesn't hand out second chances. But slowly, almost too quietly to notice at first, things began to shift. Ellis started asking for larger loans. Then he started borrowing my design sketches just to show a friend. Later, I discovered he had registered a new company using a very similar name and was quietly selling lower-quality versions of my signature pieces to his own clients. He used my reputation, my hard-earned relationships, my blood and sweat. Every time I tried to bring it up gently, he would lean back, spread his hands, and say with that warm, familiar voice, "Come on, Rowan, we're brothers. Blood is thicker than water, right? Don't be so selfish." And I let it happen, because deep down, I still believed that family was supposed to mean forever, that if I just gave a little more, worked a little harder, swallowed a little more pride, eventually he would see what I had built and be proud. I ignored the warnings, especially the ones from Aunt Naomi. She was my father's older sister, sharp-tongued, no nonsense, the kind of woman who could read a room and a soul in the same breath. One evening, she visited the workshop after hours. Finn had already gone to bed. She watched me for a long moment while I polished a new saddle-brown wallet prototype. "You're tearing down your own house brick by brick, Rowan," she said quietly, "and you're handing the bricks to Ellis with a smile." I laughed it off at the time, told her she was being too cynical, that blood meant something. She only shook her head slowly. "Blood means nothing when one person keeps bleeding and the other keeps drinking. I didn't listen. Not then. I told myself I was protecting the family, protecting Finn from seeing his uncle in a bad light, protecting the fragile idea that we could still be whole. But every yes I gave Ellis carved another crack in the foundation I had worked so hard to build. And somewhere along the way, my son Finn started watching. Quietly, carefully, the way only a boy who loves his father can watch. He saw the late nights. He saw the stress lines on my face. He saw me staring at spreadsheets until my eyes burned. He never said much, but he was learning. And the night of that gala, 9 years in the making, everything I had swallowed finally rose to the surface, because when Ellis stood up during the evening, raised his glass, and began boasting about our success, about how we had built something incredible, he looked straight at my 16-year-old son and added with a chuckle, "Some of us actually have vision. Others, well, they're still figuring out how to show up." Finn's face went pale. He dropped his eyes to the tablecloth, shoulders curling inward like he wanted to disappear. And in that single moment, something inside me finally broke. Not with anger, but with clarity. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Every head in the room turned. And that's when I looked my brother in the eyes and spoke the sentence that changed everything. The silence after my words at the gala still echoed in my ears as I drove home that night. Finn sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing city lights. He hadn't said a single word since we left the ballroom. I kept glancing over at him, my hands tight on the steering wheel. At 16, he already carried himself like someone who had learned to hold too much inside. That was the beginning of when I truly started noticing the weight my son had been carrying in silence. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, the way cracks spread across dry leather. A few weeks after the gala incident, I began coming home later and later. The workshop lights stayed on well past midnight. Ellis had caused another mess. This time, a large order canceled because he had promised clients custom designs that didn't match our standards. I spent days fixing the damage, calling suppliers, reassuring nervous buyers, and swallowing the growing knot of frustration in my chest. One Friday evening, I returned home exhausted, shoulders aching from hours bent over cutting tables. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I found Finn in the small back room we used as a secondary workspace. His school backpack was tossed in the corner. He was carefully stitching the edge of a leather wallet, his fingers moving with surprising steadiness for someone so young. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over his hands. "Finn, what are you doing?" I asked, voice low. He didn't look up right away. "Just helping a little, Dad. These edges need to be finished before Monday." I stood there, watching my 16-year-old son work on pieces that should have been my responsibility. Something heavy settled in my stomach. "You have school tomorrow," I said softly. "I know." His answer was simple, quiet, but I heard what he didn't say. From that night on, I started noticing the small things. Finn began waking up earlier on weekends. He would slip into the workshop before I did, organizing tools, prepping materials, even running small errands to the supply store on his bicycle. He never complained, never asked for thanks. He just showed up. He was sacrificing his free time, his friends, his teenage years, all to quietly lighten the load I was carrying because of my brother. The pressure from Ellis never stopped. Every few weeks there was another emergency, another request for money, another idea he borrowed without asking, another promise he made in the name of Hale Craft that I had to clean up. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, calculating how much longer I could keep the brand afloat while constantly patching holes Ellis kept punching through it. One rainy afternoon, I met Theo Grant for coffee at our usual quiet corner cafe. Theo had been my business partner and closest friend since the early days of Hale Craft. He knew every scar on my hands and every crack in my confidence. He stirred his coffee slowly, then looked at me with steady eyes. "Rowan, you look like you're drowning with your eyes open. How much longer are you going to keep carrying him?" I hesitated. My throat felt tight. "He's my brother, Theo." Theo leaned forward slightly. "And Finn is your son. Blood goes both ways. But right now, only one direction is bleeding." His words stayed with me long after I left the cafe. At home, the tension grew in quieter ways. My younger sister Sienna tried her best to keep the peace. She would call, invite us to small family dinners, and gently suggest that we all need to stick together. She hated conflict. She believed if we just talked more, everything could be fixed. But Natalie, Ellis's wife, made things worse. She had a sharp tongue and perfect timing. During one Sunday lunch at their house, she looked at Finn across the table and said with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Still spending all your weekends at the workshop, Finn? Some boys your age are out building their own futures, not fixing their father's mistakes." Finn's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten. I saw the flush creep up his neck. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I didn't. Because deep down, I was still afraid. Afraid of tearing the family apart. Afraid that if I drew the line, I would become the villain in everyone's story. The doubt gnawed at me constantly. Was I being too harsh? Was I betraying my own brother? Was I failing to keep the family together like my parents would have wanted? The questions followed me everywhere. Then one evening, Lena Brooks came to the workshop after closing time. Lena had been my lawyer for the divorce years ago, and had slowly become someone I trusted with more than just legal matters. She was sharp, honest, and never sugarcoated anything. She leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, watching me organize leather scraps I didn't need to organize. "Rowan," she said gently, "you're reaching a point where staying silent isn't protecting anyone anymore. Not Finn, not yourself, and certainly not your business." I stopped what I was doing. My hands were shaking slightly. "I don't want to destroy my family," I whispered. Lena's voice stayed calm but firm. "Sometimes protecting your child means disappointing the people who taught you that love requires sacrifice." She paused, then added softly, "You need to start preparing yourself for a decision you can't take back." I didn't answer her that night. But as I locked up the workshop and drove home under the quiet streetlights, I could feel the weight of her words settling deep in my chest. Finn was already asleep when I got home. I stood in the doorway of his room for a long time, watching him breathe. My son had been carrying pieces of my burden without me even asking, and I was still hesitating, still hoping that blood would somehow be enough. But the cracks were widening. And I knew, somewhere inside, that I was running out of time before everything finally broke. The grand ballroom glittered under soft golden lights. Hundreds of guests moved between elegant tables draped in deep burgundy linen and displays of our finest leather pieces. The scent of polished oak, fresh leather, and subtle jasmine filled the air. It was supposed to be our biggest night. The launch of Hale Craft's most ambitious collection yet. I sat at our family table with Finn beside me. He had worn the charcoal jacket I bought him last month, the one that made him look older than 16. He kept adjusting his cuffs nervously, eyes scanning the room as if searching for an escape route. Ellis stood at the center of the stage, microphone in hand, basking in the spotlight like it had always belonged to him. He raised his glass, voice booming with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate not just beautiful leather, but vision, real vision, the kind that builds empires." He paused, smiling broadly. "I'm proud to say that together, My brother and I have taken Hale Craft to heights I always dreamed of. Some of us see the big picture. Some of us, well, his eyes drifted down to our table, to Finn. Ellis let out a light chuckle, the kind that sounded warm to strangers but felt like ice to me. Others are still figuring it out. Some boys Finn's age dream big, chase real success. But my nephew here, he seems more comfortable with his hands in the workshop, doing the manual work. No real ambition, just good old-fashioned labor, bless his heart. A few polite laughs rippled through the room. But I saw my son. Finn's face drained of color, his shoulders curled inward as if trying to make himself smaller. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared down at his plate, eyes glassy, willing the floor to swallow him whole. In that single moment, something inside me shattered. 9 years of swallowed anger, 9 years of excuses, 9 years of telling myself he's family while watching my son quietly bleed so I could keep the peace. It all rose up at once. I pushed my chair back. The sound of wood scraping against marble cut through the lingering chuckles like a crack of thunder. Every head in the ballroom turned toward me. I stood tall, heart pounding, but my voice came out steady, dangerously calm. Ellis. The room fell into a heavy, breathless silence. Everything you're about to celebrate tonight, it was never yours. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ellis's smile faltered. Natalie's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Whispers began to spread like wildfire across the tables. I looked straight at my brother, then let my gaze sweep across the room before returning to him. This story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when blood stops meaning blind loyalty and starts meaning boundaries. If you've ever been used by the people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me. Because tonight, I'm finally telling the truth I should have spoken years ago. My hands trembled slightly at my sides, but I didn't sit down. Finn looked up at me then. His eyes were wide with shock, fear, and something else, a fragile spark of relief. In that heartbeat, everything became crystal clear. I had spent years convincing myself that keeping the family together was worth any cost, that my silence was love, that my sacrifices were noble. But watching my son shrink under his uncle's public mockery, seeing the shame burn across his young face, I finally understood the truth I had been running from. If I stayed quiet any longer, Finn would carry this wound for the rest of his life. He would learn that love means enduring humiliation. He would learn that blood gives others permission to take everything and give nothing back. I couldn't let that happen. Not to my son. Not anymore. As the whispers grew louder and Ellis's face turned from confusion to anger, I felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over me. This was the moment. There was no going back. The line I had been terrified to draw for 9 long years. I had just drawn it in front of 200 witnesses. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what would come next. Because protecting my son mattered more than preserving the illusion of family. The days after the gala felt like stepping off a cliff and learning how to breathe on the way down. I didn't sleep much that first week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Finn's pale face under the ballroom lights and heard my own voice cutting through the silence. The decision had been made in a single heartbeat, but living with it was something else entirely. The very next morning, I called Lena Brooks. We met at her quiet office downtown before the sun had fully risen. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She simply opened a fresh legal pad, looked at me across the desk and asked, "Are you sure you're ready for this, Rowan?" I swallowed hard. My hands were still shaking from the night before. "I'm sure," I said quietly. "I don't want to destroy him. I just want to stop letting him destroy us." Lena nodded once and got to work. Over the following days, we moved quickly but carefully. We terminated every shared contract. We sent formal notices revoking Ellis's permission to use the Hale Craft name and designs. We changed access codes, froze joint accounts, and blocked any further financial overlap. Every step felt heavy, like I was cutting away pieces of something I had once believed was unbreakable. Aunt Naomi stepped in without being asked. She made quiet phone calls to several longtime suppliers and partners she had known for decades. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact as she clarified the truth behind the years of confusion. She never raised her voice. She simply refused to let lies spread unchecked. Meanwhile, at home, Finn was struggling. He moved through the house like a ghost. His eyes avoided mine. He barely ate. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor with his hands clenched between his knees. When I sat down beside him, he spoke in a small, broken voice. "Dad, this is my fault, isn't it? Because of what Uncle Ellis said about me. If I hadn't been there, if I had just been better." His words hit me harder than any insult Ellis had ever thrown. I reached over and gently turned his face toward me. "Listen to me, Finn. None of this is because of you. You are not the reason I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I finally realized I've been teaching you the wrong lesson for years, that you have to stay quiet and carry everyone else's weight just because we share the same last name." He didn't cry then, but I could see the storm behind his eyes. Ellis and Natalie didn't stay silent. They began calling and texting furiously. When I stopped answering, they went through Sienna. My sister showed up at the workshop one evening, her face tight with worry and frustration. "Rowan, they're saying you're trying to ruin the family. Natalie keeps crying on the phone. Ellis says you've turned your back on blood. Can't you at least sit down and talk with them face to face?" I looked at my little sister for a long moment. My chest ached. "I've spent 9 years sitting down and talking, Sienna. It never changed anything. From now on, everything goes through Lena. No more private conversations." Sienna left with tears in her eyes, but I didn't follow her. I couldn't afford to waver anymore. The hardest moment came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Finn and I were alone in the workshop, cleaning up after a long week. The air smelled of leather oil and sawdust. Golden sunlight slanted through the high windows, catching on floating dust particles. We worked side by side in silence, wiping down tables, organizing tools, sweeping scraps from the floor. Then Finn suddenly stopped. He stood there holding a soft piece of scrap leather, shoulders trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Dad, I don't want you to lose everything because of me." The tears came then, hot, quiet, and unstoppable. "I kept working because I saw how tired you were. I thought if I helped more, you wouldn't have to worry so much about Uncle Ellis. I didn't want you to break. But now, because of what happened at the gala, everything's falling apart, and it's my fault." I dropped the rag I was holding and pulled him into my arms without thinking. He buried his face in my shoulder and cried like the little boy he still was underneath the brave front he had been wearing for years. I held him tight, my own eyes burning. "Finn," I whispered against his hair, "you are not the problem. You never were. I'm the one who waited too long. I'm the one who let fear keep me chained. But I'm done letting other people's choices cost you your peace." We stood like that for a long time, surrounded by the familiar smell of leather and the quiet hum of the workshop that had seen both our best and worst days. When his sobs finally quieted, I pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. "I'm not doing this to punish anyone. I'm doing this to set us free." Finn searched my face for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of something lighter in his expression. As the sun began to set outside the tall windows, I realized the weight I had carried for 9 years was finally starting to lift. Not because the fight was over, but because I had stopped carrying it alone. And my son no longer had to carry it with me in silence. 6 months had passed since that night at the gala. The workshop felt different now, lighter somehow. The heavy tension that once clung to every corner had slowly dissolved, replaced by the quiet rhythm of honest work and genuine peace. Hale Craft was thriving again. Without the constant drain of fixing Ellis's mistakes, I could finally pour everything into what mattered most: quality, craftsmanship, and the loyal customers who had stayed with us through the storm. Orders were steady. The leather felt richer under my hands. Even the air in the workshop smelled cleaner, as if the building itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Finn had changed too. He no longer slipped into the workshop before dawn or stayed until his eyes were red from exhaustion. He still came on weekends, but only when he wanted to. Most of his time now belonged to school, friends, and a small leather design project he had started on his own. A simple but elegant notebook cover with clean lines and thoughtful stitching. He worked on it with a focus I hadn't seen in him for years. Watching him create something purely for himself brought a warmth to my chest I thought I had forgotten. Ellis, on the other hand, was facing the consequences he had long avoided. His own store began struggling badly. Without access to our suppliers and with his reputation quietly crumbling among those who knew the truth, the orders dried up. I heard through distant channels that he was angry, bitter, and blaming everyone but himself. Natalie's calls to Sienna became less frequent, replaced by long silences. I didn't celebrate their difficulties. I simply felt relieved, like a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried for far too long. One quiet evening, Aunt Naomi, who we all now called Aunt Vesper, invited a small group of us to her house. Just family, no grand speeches, no audience. She waited until we had finished dinner and the plates were cleared. Then she looked around the table with those sharp, knowing eyes and spoke plainly. "Blood is not a license," she said calmly. "It is not permission for one person to keep taking while everyone else keeps giving. Rowan carried this family on his back for 9 years. He nearly lost himself, and he almost lost his son in the process. Enough is enough." Sienna sat quietly, tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't argue. She only nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something she had been avoiding for years. I didn't speak much that night. I just listened. For the first time in nearly a decade, I slept without waking up to check my phone in fear of another emergency text from Ellis. The constant knot of anxiety in my stomach had loosened. I could breathe again. But the moment that truly sealed everything happened on a cool autumn evening. Finn and I were alone in the workshop. The lights were low, casting long, gentle shadows across the workbenches. The smell of fresh leather and faint linseed oil filled the air. Outside, a light rain tapped softly against the windows. We sat side by side on old wooden stools, not working, just being. Finn traced his finger along the edge of one of his finished notebook covers. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Dad," I turned to him. "Thank you for choosing me instead of keeping the peace." His words landed gently, yet they carried the weight of everything we had been through. I felt my throat tighten. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I reached over and rested my hand on his shoulder. "Finn," I said quietly, "you don't ever have to prove your worth by suffering. You don't have to earn love by carrying what isn't yours to carry." I paused, letting the words settle between us. Real family, real love, is a place where you're allowed to say no and still be loved. Finn looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were bright, not with tears this time, but with quiet understanding. A small, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth, the kind I hadn't seen in years. We sat there together as the rain continued to fall outside. Two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unbroken, but finally free. This journey taught me something I wish I had learned much sooner. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is stop carrying someone who refuses to walk beside you. And sometimes choosing yourself and your child isn't abandonment. It's the beginning of real healing. If you've ever felt trapped by the word family, constantly giving while receiving only guilt and pressure in return, I hope this story reminds you that love should never come with chains. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to protect your peace. And you are allowed to choose freedom, even when it means walking away from those who were supposed to love you the most. Because real family doesn't bleed you dry. Real love doesn't demand your silence. It gives you room to breathe. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.